Good evening. Oh, goodness. Good evening. Yeah. If you're out in the lobby, please make your way to your designated classroom. It is time for our study. That means if you're an adult, come on in here, please. All right. As we continue our study in the book of Genesis, we left off in the end of chapter 4, talking about Lamech, one of the descendants of Cain, and how Lamech wasn't such a great man as we're about to read. And then it will start, after this chapter, talking about the descendants of Adam from the line of Seth. All right, so let's get started. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23. If you don't want to follow along up here, but you want to read it from your own copy of God's Word, we're in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 23. It says, Then Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, wives of Lamech. Listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. Last week we talked about how Lamech was not such a great guy, how he is arrogant, how he is proud, and he is a descendant of Cain, which we talked about how that kind of shows that there wasn't a lot of godly teaching in his raising. So Lamech here is saying to his quote-unquote wives, Adah and Zillah, whom the language should suggest that he is collecting like trophies. He says, Hear my voice, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. He is singing a song. He has a poem about murder. He's killed a man, and he's wounded a man for hurting me. And then he goes on to say this, If Cain will be avenged sevenfold. Remember how God said that whoever killed Cain would be killed, he would be avenged sevenfold. If Cain will be killed or be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold, even more so than Cain. He's saying, infinitely more will I be avenged. He is proud, he is arrogant. There's not a whole lot said about this Lamech, but we know that he is proud, he is an arrogant person. Now, why does God even take time to mention this about one of Cain's descendants? For what is about to happen in the narrative of Genesis is to show the setup of how the world becomes more and more corrupt toward the days of the flood. That's the point of what God is saying here. Verse 25, And Adam had sex with his wife again. He knew his wife, he knew Eve again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. So they have another son. They name him Seth. The word Seth means seed. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel. If you remember back to Genesis 3:15, that prophecy of a coming descendant from Eve, from her seed, that would crush the head of the snake while being bruised on his heel by the snake. The question continues, okay, maybe Cain was supposed to be it. No, Cain sinned. He fell under the temptation of sin. Maybe Abel was supposed to be it. No, Abel died. Maybe Seth will be this seed that God has prophesied about. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then people began to call on the name of Yahweh. So Seth grows up, he matures, he has a son, and he names the son Enosh. And in that day, the time when Enosh was born, people began to call on the name of Yahweh. Now this is kind of a confusing statement in the Hebrew. There's a little bit that it's talking about here. They called on the name of Yahweh in a way that they showed their trust in Yahweh, but really the way this language is trying to say this is saying, this is when formal, organized religion, worship had started. Now you had your worship that Adam and Eve offered God, and they taught Abel and Cain how to worship God, and Abel did it right and Cain didn't, according to God's word. But really in the time of Enosh, it's saying that formal, organized religious meetings for worshiping God started taking place. People began to call on the name of Yahweh. That leads us into chapter 5, the descendants of Adam. The descendants of Adam. There's one main thing I want you to notice about any genealogy you read about in the Bible, but especially this one. This one's a very important one. These people will live for hundreds of years, centuries. It'll say they have lots of kids. Think of how many children you can have if you're living to be 900 plus years old. You have a lot of children in that time. Yet each genealogy focuses on one son. Why does it focus on one son, do you think? In each genealogical record, why does it focus on one son? The genealogy of Christ. It's leading towards the promise of this coming seed. This coming seed. It focuses on one son. It's not just the lineage to Christ, but the lineage to everyone else. Because this seed will lead to Noah. And we all come from Noah. Think about that. We'll get to that here in a little while. But we all come from Noah. Just remember that going through this chapter. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. So this is the record it's saying of the genealogy of Adam, his line of descendants. In the day that God created man, he created Adam, he made him in the likeness of God. So God is the one who started this whole record, creating Adam in his likeness. Then we have, he created them male and female and blessed them and called them mankind in the day they created them. So he didn't just create Adam, he created Eve as well. And this is how the rest of mankind would get its start. Adam and Eve. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Now we know that Cain and Abel were older than Seth. So before Adam was 130, he was having children. But when he was 130 years old, Seth was born. So the universe has been in existence for 130 years by the time we read of Seth being born in the last chapter. So we know how much time has been covered. Now it doesn't cover every little thing that happens in human history in this span. And this chapter covers many, many, many years. Many years. It doesn't cover every little thing that happens. But it does cover some major things that happen as far as who is being born at what point in history. After he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Okay, so after Adam begot Seth, he lived another 800 years. Had other sons and daughters within that 800 years. You're going to have a lot of sons and daughters in 800 years. Had lots of them. And notice that it says he had sons and daughters. So this is not, Cain, Abel, and Seth are not the only people that Adam and Eve had. We knew that about when we talked about Cain having a wife. But they're not the only people that Adam and Eve had. They had other sons and daughters. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years. And eventually what God had said about him dying, at least in the physical sense, came to be. He eventually died. At 930 years, almost 1,000 years old, but he died. Something we need to notice about people living at this time. It's not like they lived 90 years and then spent another 800 years in a condition as what we would think a 90-year-old would be. They didn't age to 90 and then spend 800 years as a 90-year-old. Most likely what happened was around their 300 or 400 would probably be something like 30 or 40s. And they lived in a much better condition of the world at this time. If you remember all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, on day 2, God created, he separated the waters from the waters. Remember I said way back then we come back to that. Well, this is now, we're coming back to it. The waters from the waters with the expanse in the middle. It's talking about there was probably a canopy of water over the earth. What that would have done to the pressure of the world, it would have created more pressure, air pressure within the world, causing more oxygen in the world. I was talking to Don about this earlier today, and raise your hand if you know what amber is. Ever seen Jurassic Park? You see the mosquito in the amber? It's tree sap that's covered a mosquito and it's fossilized. The amount of oxygen we have in our world today is about 21%. 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. We need 100% oxygen. We breathe 100% oxygen to live. 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. They've actually drilled into these pieces of amber and into air bubbles that were trapped in this amber and studied how much oxygen was left behind in pieces of amber that would have dated before the flood. There's about 34% of that atmosphere is oxygen. Now we have 21% oxygen. They had about 35% oxygen in their atmosphere. You know what that would do to your blood that runs on oxygen? These people could run 100 miles and not get tired. They could run 100 miles and not get tired. These people lived 900-something years old because the way that God had created the earth, even though it is starting to be corrupted by sin and is not as perfect as it was when God originally created it, is still in this type of condition. What will change all of that is the flood. We'll get to that later. It's still in this type of condition. Raise your hand if you ever heard of Neanderthal. Neanderthal, okay. If you remember way back when we studied Christian evidences, we talked about Neanderthal as a species of creature is not real. The bones they find of Neanderthal always have larger foreheads than people do in their skulls today, okay? Now, I don't know if this is what the answer is, but it makes sense if you look at all the evidence. There are three main parts on a human that continually grow their entire life. The ears, the nose, and the brow. They all grow your entire life. They keep growing. How big did you think somebody's eyebrows can be at 930 years old? Pretty big. That could be something that happened. Neanderthal could just be regular man with larger brows. And we talked about a little bit last week all the different things people could learn to do with their own hands, with creating new technology in almost 1,000 years of life. What people could learn to do, what they could craft. People were not idiots at this time. People were not simple-minded at this time. People still aren't simple-minded. But sin has not taken the full effect of how nature has worked in us. We don't even live most of the time to 100 years. These people live way past 900 years, and their genetic codes, their genetic pool has not been so corrupted like ours is. We are so far removed from the original creation that our genetic pool has been corrupted through mutations and whatnot because of sin. But think about this. We all come from Adam. So every variation that we find in any person today had to exist, that possibility of variation had to exist in the DNA of Adam. Now this is just the first generation removed from Adam. That DNA pool is not going to become like it is today. That's why it wasn't a problem to marry sisters and stuff like that, because the DNA pool was not corrupt with mutations like it would be today. I hope that makes sense. That's just a few observations I want you to notice about how long these people lived. But no matter how long they lived, they still died. They still died. We still come to death. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. After he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. So Seth dies 912 years later. Enosh lived 90 years. Now this is still while Adam and Seth are alive. If you do the math, they're all still alive. It's not like he died, then this happened. It's all happening together. Enosh lived 90 years and begot Canaan. Now he probably had kids before that and definitely had kids after that. But this is when he begot Canaan. And the reason we're focusing on these names is because it's in the line to Noah, which is in the line to Christ, as we would eventually find out. After he begot Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Canaan lived 70 years and begot Mahalalel. After he begot Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. Now this is a lot of numbers, saying it's repetitious, but just think about the ages they're living and these individual sons that they're having. That's the line it's supposed to be giving. Mahalalel lived 65 years and begot Jared. After he begot Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Jared lived 162 years. And by the time he was 162, he begot Enoch. After he begot Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had sons and daughters, that making his age 962 years when he died. Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. Okay, so the phrasing has changed. He walked with God 300 years. This term walk could also be described as lived. He dwelt with God. Maybe not necessarily in the most literal way, but he was well-pleasing with God. He lived faithfully to God for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Something was happening that was right before Enoch for him to do this. He was taught right by his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather and his great-great-great-grandfather. They were teaching him something right about God. He lived with God, walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So this is a little bit different. Enoch apparently did not die. That's what it's saying. He was not found dead. He just wasn't there anymore. He lived 365 years, then God took him. This has only happened to two people, recorded at least, from the Word of God in all of history. Who's the other person? Elijah. Elijah was the other person. Elijah was taken up into heaven by a fiery chariot. Remember, we read about in 2 Kings. He was taken up in a fiery chariot. But Enoch walked with God, and God took him. He did not die. He was not found anymore. God took him. I don't even know how to imagine what that's like. How to even start to imagine. He didn't experience death. He's one of the exceptions to the rule of it is appointed once for all men to die, and then the judgment. He's one of those exceptions. Why did God take Enoch? No clue. Apparently because he was so faithful. He walked with God all his life. He was that faithful that God decided to take him. But maybe it's because if he didn't take him, Enoch might have fallen away, might have experienced the flood. He might have been old enough to experience the flood. We don't know. I'm not going to speculate any further. All we know is that Enoch walked with God and God took him for it. He didn't kill him. He didn't die. He went with God. Methuselah lived 187 years and begot Lamech. After he begot Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Somebody tell me what I'm thinking about this 969 years. What's the significance of that? Oldest man, yeah. He was the oldest man ever recorded to live. Ever that we've ever had recorded. 969 years was the record. Maybe there was someone who lived longer that was related to them, but Methuselah in this line is the only one recorded that long. Something that's interesting about Methuselah, though, if you do the math, when you calculate all the ages together, how they would be contemporaries of each other, Methuselah dies the exact year the flood happens. Did Methuselah die in the flood? I don't know. Maybe he died before the flood even happened. But it's interesting. The same year, if you do the math, the same year that the flood happens is the same year Methuselah dies. Maybe he died in it, maybe he did not. But he lived 969 years and he died. Lamech, now this is not the same Lamech that we read about in chapter 4 that's a descendant of Cain. This is a descendant of Seth, who is the son of Methuselah. This Lamech lived 182 years and had a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which Yahweh has cursed." So all this time, as they might have been faithful to Yahweh, to God, they were still being tested by this curse, have to toil in their work that God put on Adam. It's happening to all mankind. The earth is becoming more and more corrupt, and they're having to toil probably even harder than they did when Adam had to, day in and day out. And he has Noah, and he names him Noah because the name Noah roughly means rest or comfort. He says, maybe he will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which Yahweh has cursed. After he begot Noah, Lamech lived 595 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Before I go any further, I want to say this. Sometimes you'll see genealogies end in this way, with Shem labeled first. According to some of the evidence, we'll read about it even more in Genesis. Shem was not the firstborn, but he's first listed here. What do you think the reason is that Shem is first listed, if he's not the firstborn? We read the same thing when we have the genealogy for Abraham, or Abram at that time, with his brothers. Abram wasn't the firstborn, but he's listed first. Why is that? Exactly. He's listed first because he's the one who the Messiah will come through. The seed that God promised in Genesis 3:15 will come through this line. So he's listed first because of importance. Seth, Ham, and Japheth. In fact, if you do the math and stuff, it'll say Shem was born when Noah was 502, not 500. So all this is not a contradiction, and what it means is Noah began having children when he was 500 years old. But these aren't triplets. They have different ages. Shem was just born when he was 502. It's the same thing with Abraham and his brothers. They're not triplets. They're different ages. But they began having these children at this certain age. So Noah began having these children when he was 500 years old. Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Look at the timeline of Genesis from Adam to the flood. You have Adam created and then the flood happening. Okay. Look at the end. This is when they died. Roughly in the creation, 500 years later, 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later. Adam would have been contemporaries all the way to Lamech. Imagine Methuselah taking Lamech to see his ancestor, Adam, who was still alive at this point. And all the stories Adam could have told them about the days of the Garden of Eden, about the importance of obeying God. Think of all that. Sometimes we read this account and we go, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And we forget to do the math with these ages that they were all contemporaries, or most of them were contemporaries, and met. Now imagine all the descendants Noah or Adam would have had by the time Lamech was born. All the descendants. Think of your own family tree. You have you, then you have your parents, then your grandparents, that's 4, and then your great-grandparents, that's 8. It continues like that. It didn't take long to have a lot of people in your family. He was living over 900 years old, plus all these descendants. Imagine the family gatherings, the family reunions, trying to remember everybody's name. It would have been a nightmare. And they could have talked about so many things like the Garden of Eden, but after that, Adam has died. So this is how they line up with everybody else. I'll let you have a few seconds to look at that further. It's just you can find these charts on the internet. It's interesting. Somebody does the math and sees how they lived together. Maybe, I don't know if they lived right there together, maybe not, but they definitely lived at the same time as each other for the most part. All right. This is very cool, though. Maybe this is a coincidence. I'm not the biggest believer in coincidence, but maybe this is a coincidence. But I think this is very, very cool. Providence of God is what I'm saying this is. Look, these are what each of these names mean in the line of Adam. Look at this. Adam means man, Seth means appointed, Enosh means mortal, Kenan means sorrow, Mahalalel means the blessed God, Jared means shall come down, Enoch means teaching, Methuselah means his death shall bring, Lamech means despairing, and Noah means rest. Look at these together. Man was appointed to mortal sorrow when the blessed God shall come down, teaching, and his death shall bring the despairing rest. What is that? That's the gospel in names. I'll read that again for you. Man appointed to mortal sorrow, when the blessed God, he shall come down, teaching, and his death shall bring the despairing rest. That's the gospel in names. Isn't that cool? I've never noticed that before until studying for this. Looking up the name, what each name means, that's the gospel message in names. I think it's very cool, the providence of God in that. All right, now chapter 6, worldwide sin. Chapter 6. Now we're getting into Noah's Ark, where we're going to spend about 10 years on that. Chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, Now it came to pass, when people began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, I'll keep going, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. So it came to pass, when people began to multiply, so all these descendants of Adam, descendants of Cain, they're multiplying on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now there is a controversy going on about this verse here. What does the sons of God mean in this controversy? What do people say the sons of God are? Anyone know about this controversy? Maybe.
There are people who believe that this means that angels came down and took mortal wives.
Exactly.
But I don't get that from this myself.
No. So there's a group of people, I don't know how large it is, that believe that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. The sons of God, they say, are angels. Angels. Okay. You might have heard that before. I've heard it many times. Here's where that belief comes from. Other passages say sons of God, and it is actually referring to angels. As best we know, it's referring to angels. There's an assumption, though, that every time it says the sons of God, it's referring to angels. That's the assumption. Nowhere in the Hebrew, in the context of anywhere in this passage, suggests angels. Furthermore, if you remember what Jesus says to the Sadducees, talking about men in the resurrection, in the afterlife, after they go to heaven, they will be like the angels. Now, a lot of people take that concept and create the false doctrine that men become angels when they die. The Bible doesn't teach that. What Jesus is saying, got to remember the context. What Jesus is saying there, they're talking about marriage in a way. The Sadducees were bringing this example about marriage. Who would be this person's husband in the resurrection? And Jesus says they'll be like angels in the resurrection. They're not going to be marrying or given to marriage. And they can't fulfill the duties of being married because they're spiritual. They don't have physical body parts. So this can't be angels. Whatever this is, this can't be angels, because that would contradict Jesus. I don't think God's going to contradict himself. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. What could this probably mean? What I think it means, now I don't know for sure. I'm going to go ahead and say that. I don't know for sure exactly what this means. What this probably means, from what lines up with the rest of Scripture, is that the sons of God were those who were faithful to God to a certain extent. These are people who worship God, just like it said earlier when we talked about at this time they called upon the name of the Lord. Probably the descendants of Seth is probably what's happening. Saw the daughters of men. Probably the descendants of Cain. It could happen the other way, daughters of God and the sons of men too. Probably what's happening is there's intermarrying within different moral beliefs. It's probably what's happening. Different moral beliefs are marrying together. Those who are faithful to God and those who are not. And they saw that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And Yahweh said, in saying this, he said, "My spirit will not strive with mankind forever. For he is indeed flesh, yet his days will be 120 years." Let me tell you a little confession. When he says 120 years, he says, "My spirit will not dwell with their flesh." Okay, they're going after fleshly things. "My spirit will not dwell with them forever." He's fed up with their wickedness. Their days will be 120 years. I used to think, when I was younger, that this means people don't live over 120 years. Until I kept reading the Bible. Because then you run into a problem if that's what this means. Frequently you have people after Noah, after this time, of people living 120 years. People today sometimes live over 120 years. Very rare, but it happens. So that's not what this is meaning. What this is meaning is God is saying 120 more years for them to repent, for me to be patient with them, then I'm wiping them out. I cannot take this any longer. They have 120 years left to get their act together. And then I'm wiping them out. And there were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God had sex with the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now you might have heard of the Hebrew word for the word that's translated giants here. It's the word Nephilim. Raise your hand if you ever heard the word Nephilim. The Nephilim. It's not a common word to hear. Some translations have it, not all of them. Nephilim. The reason they just transliterate the Hebrew word into the English as Nephilim is because people have not the first clue what it means. And they don't want to get into big debates about what it means. Some people think it means giants. Okay? Some people think it means fallen angels. Again, these are the people who subscribe to this angels belief. Some people think it means mighty ones. Ones who were conquerors. It's probably a mixture of giants and conquerors. The reason that some translations translated as giants is because that's the easiest way to translate the word. It may not always mean that, but that's the easiest way to translate it. And there's other historical evidence, fossils we can find of humans, that were actual Goliath-sized people that date back to this time before the flood. Goliath-sized people. So there were giants in the land, it's true, but that may not be what Nephilim means. Probably the best translation for Nephilim is conqueror. People who were known for their cruelty, known for their conquering ability, their warfare, for their violence. And it says, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Maybe they were taller than usual. We see that even after the flood, there were men, with Goliath, for example, who was taller than usual, than the average man. Maybe they were. So that's why I leave it here as giants. There were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. What it's not is fallen angels. It's not fallen angels. Now, the term Nephilim can mean fallen, but it's really means those who fall upon someone, meaning someone who conquers someone. Not a fallen angel. It's not fallen angels. Then Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humanity was vast in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his mind was only evil continually. This good creation, the thing that made his creation very good, the thing that was the top, the pinnacle of his creation, has now corrupted the world from their choice to sin. Over 1,000 years of this. It's corrupted the earth. It's corrupted themselves. He says it's vast in the earth. It's great in the earth. The wickedness of humanity. And that every intent, there was not a day, not a thought, not a feeling that passed through somebody that was not wicked. Sometimes I feel like I know people who are just like that. Now, I know there are plenty of people, through the grace of God, that are not this way today. Not everybody is thoroughly wicked in every way. But these people have become so corrupt that every intent of the thoughts of his mind, of his heart, was only evil continually. You know the story of what happens next. Next week, we'll start to cover what God's plan to do about this is. Thank you for your attention.